I am unashamed. What about you?
I mean, Al, you're not, if you look over at, the fellow staff members, they're not putting the time in.
Well, you got to understand that I've been doing this a long time, so there's a reason why that I'm doing a sermon series that coincides with a podcast series, because I got triple action going here.
Yeah.
Because usually preaching is a kind of a lonely business, because it's just kind of your thoughts and the Holy Spirit and the Word of God. But it's kind of nice for me because I kind of got y'all to bounce stuff off of. Jase is doing some late night.
I spend at the most on notes before Sunday morning. I'll pick up my Bible. I'd say less than 5 minutes, 90% of the time, 95.
Yeah, and because your situation,
sometimes 10 minutes.
But your situation is unique because you're basically just given a different sort of version of the gospel every week
time,
because you got people coming in.
That's right.
That are seeking and searching. So it's a little bit different setup. I'm in a situation where I got some of the same people I've been talking to for 30 years. Yeah. It's hard to motivate people that you've been talking to 30 years.
Especially people over 40.
That's exactly right. They've heard a lot.
So I had to come up with an argument, and it was when I say, why do you keep repeating the same thing? I said, I know what I sound like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, don't I? I said, the same story.
You just went BCB, book, chapter, verse.
And they all look, and I said, okay, you already know this. I said, but the person seated next to you is from Iowa. They've never heard this. Mm-hmm. I'm not giving it to you. I'm giving it to them.
We're representing God. Jesus is the image of God. You introduce Jesus to people who don't know him.
That's it.
I have learned from the Beatitudes after my conviction, which lasted a few hours. I thought, I'm not good at these qualities.
Yeah, this is something I need to grow.
Yeah, I need to revisit.
So I wanted to mention last time, but I decided to hold it to kick us off today, Jase, that those first four Beatitudes, we're in Matthew 5, by the way, if you're new to it. The last one, we kind of opened this up, and Jase kind of broke it down that the first four is your heart to God. The first four of these Beatitudes, blessed are. And then the second half are to each other or other people, which we're going to talk about. But I thought about the perfect illustration, or I guess I should say example, of people that I observed this in. There's a lot of people. I've seen this in people. And usually it's older people, usually mature, wise people. Mm-hmm. But one of our old mentors, Jase, Carl Allison, his wife Barbara, both of them have fallen asleep in the Lord. They're waiting on the resurrection. Wonderful people. And when I was able to speak at Carl's funeral, and I said then, and it's still true to this day, that he's the best man I've ever known, and including myself. And he was just a good man. He was solid.
He was a numbers man, which was funny.
That's right.
Because I said one time, I know what your favorite book in the Bible is.
I've said that too.
He said, "What's that?" I said, "Numbers."
But you know what? Line was always this line right here. But guys, the best days are yet to come.
The best is yet to come.
You know what's funny? He taught me something one time because I was making fun of him of keeping up with all the numbers. And that's why you got to be careful when you take on, I think, icons in the faith. Because boy, he made me speechless one time. He said, "Well, brother," because I was making fun of him about.
He would do the count every Monday, like they would. Who was there the day before?
Like, numbers are up, And I was because in my mind I'm thinking, does it really matter that we know all the numbers of all the groups? Because we meet in homes. There are meetings in outside an apartment, but he would gather all those numbers and he would say in meetings, "Hey, the numbers are up," numbers
or the numbers are down.
He's the one that offered me some advice when I said, "So Carl, just so you know, you're older than I am." I said, "So when does this sex thing just play out?"
Oh boy!
And he looked at me. He said, "Brother, you're going to ask someone older than I am."
Well, then he came back with hey, Phil, just because there's snow on the mountain doesn't mean there's not fire in the furnace. That was his line.
So I made some joke about numbers, and he went, and then he said, "Well, brother, do you know how Jesus knew that he had lost the one sheep?" And I was just perplexed with that question. He said, because he counted them.
That's good. I never heard that before.
I said,
touche.
Well played, sir. You never hear that in the sermon. He's got 99. He lost one. Well, how do you know
he hadn't counted the 100?
How do you know he lost one? Well, he was sitting there counting them.
I look forward to running with Carl Allison once we get in the immortality stage.
So I wanted. Now that we're kind of just telling a little bit about him, Carl he's a man's man. He was an All-American football and baseball player at the University of Oklahoma.
Yep.
He's been recognized as one of the top 100 players in the history of the University of Oklahoma.
Amazing.
Which is pretty amazing. All-American. He was a catcher. He had offers from the Chicago Bears, New York Yankees to go either professional sport. Turned him down because he had married Barbara and they had their first son, Dirk. And he said, you know what, if I go play pro ball, it probably won't turn out well for me spiritually. And so instead he went and started the first football program.
That was one of the reasons I didn't pursue it.
He was the dean at the school that Al and I went to, the Bible school.
Yep.
And I'm not going to lie, because I was the only troubled student out of the 4 classes, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and senior. I spent more time in the dean's office. And I'm not going to lie, Phil, even though he was showing me love and stern grace and mercy, I could see it in his eyes a few times. I knew what he was thinking, that at that moment, he wanted to line up and just stick his shoulder right in my chest and send me through that wall.
And he could have done it. You remember days when you and I were late, because we were driving in from out here. So we kind of got in a little pattern there. Because chapel is where you went first. And we were slipping into chapel. We were just like 5 minutes late there, about 2 or 3 times. Old Carl called us both in. He said, I've been noticing you boys been a little late coming into chapel. He looked at Jace. He said, you got some water in your alarm clock down there on the river?
I remember what he said that day. He said, let me tell you, if you leave at a time where a red light could determine whether you're on time or late, you're leaving way too late.
His philosophy was it's better to be an hour early than a minute late. So Carl, the reason I bring him up, obviously we love him. His daughter was my administrative assistant at the church for 15 years, and she's still there. She's wonderful. But the reason I want to mention him is because I looked at that, Jace, when we were going through this, the last podcast. Poor in spirit, meaning Jesus first. That was he and Barbara. Meek, absolutely, but strong. I mean, meek doesn't mean weak.
That's right.
Very strong. And then this one about mourn and then hunger and thirst for righteousness. So Carl, I'm not sure how old he was, but his second son, Darren, who you coached and taught, Dad, when he was a teenager, he got married, had a baby girl, and one night he and his wife were killed in a car wreck. Terrible. Back in the early 80s. And so Kellett tells the story. He went over when he found out. Jim Moran came to him, which is another one of our elders, and said, we got to go over and meet a state trooper at Carl and Barbara's house because Darren and Susan have been killed. And we're going to tell him. Of course, Kellett's the youth guy. He's young.
And the baby survived.
The baby survived.
Yeah.
And so they show up over there. The state trooper comes. Carl and Barbara don't know anything yet. They're in their house. So the state trooper comes in with Jim Moran, Mike Kellett, and tells them that their middle son, who was, I think, around 30 at the time, late 20s, and his wife were killed in a terrible car wreck in Mississippi. But their granddaughter had survived, although she had broken her hip and some legs, and so she had some injuries. And Mike says, as soon as he said it, of course, Barbara began to cry and weep, because I thought about this mourn. And Carl didn't cry, but he just put his arm around her and he said, well, Barbie, this is what we raised him for. Because we know he made it. He's in heaven. And I just thought in that moment to get that word, that news about your son and daughter-in-law, I thought that's how I want to mourn. I mean, of course you're sad. You've lost your son, but at the same time, he didn't have any doubts that heaven was real, and that's what it was all about. So I thought about him.
It never slowed him down one bit.
Never did. He never felt sorry for himself. I never saw he and Barbara do anything except continue to be
blame God or
Right.
you know. It's like that's why when you're around people who are more mature in the faith, like him, these are not just words on a page or something you're a part of to make you feel better. I mean, Jesus' resurrection, you could tell, was real to him. I mean, he had thought about it on a daily basis, or you wouldn't have that response.
right. That's exactly right.
And
I'll say this
At the end of anybody's day, that's all you have.
So I'll say this. So when Carl was about to pass away, and so I went over to see him. He was in his bed at his house, and I think he only lived a day or two more after this conversation. But I went over, and he was still lucid, but he was waning. He was ready to go, and I left there super encouraged. He did just what he always does. You guys are going to take it to the next level. Best is yet to come. We help let you lay the foundation. He said, just build on what we did. I mean, I left out of there. He had me. I went to encourage him, and then he encouraged me.
that's the way I was with Kathy Freeman, a couple of years ago. Because I thought Missy and I was fixing to go in there, and they're like, she's literally has hours. And I thought, boy, this is, what am I going to say? This is going to be tough. And so when we walked in, she said, come over. And she said, I can't get up. She was laying in her bed. She said, y'all come beside me. And so we just piled up, right next to her in the bed. And she took over the conversation. She's like, I just want you to know I'm filled with joy because my kids have found Jesus. And here's what I would like to happen. I mean, she just had everything lined out and was genuinely excited.
Yeah.
She's like, this is where I want to be, and I think I've accomplished, through Christ everything I could, and this is a joyous day.
And she asked you to do her funeral.
Well, yeah, I didn't like that part, but
Jason never done a funeral.
Yeah,
and
which was one of the toughest things I had to do, but it really, I felt at peace after seeing her boldness.
Yeah.
In death. I thought, well, who am I to say that, I'm not. It's the plan. She's like, this is the plan.
That's what you do.
You're doing the funeral because there are a lot of people going to show up that don't know Jesus. I would like for you to share that with them. That's kind of your lane.
That's right.
And so
and you had helped lead her to Christ and been a part of her kids.
Yeah, yeah.
And what's amazing about that funeral, Jace, is of course you did great, and so did her son who spoke.
He did,
and it just blew me away, because I mean. He far exceeded. I was thinking what it's going to be, but he did awesome. I mean, he just totally honored his mom.
Well, he told me, the night before, he was like, "Well, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to say anything." I was like, "Okay, that's fine." And so it's that classic deal about the next day we get there, and I'm like, "All right, I was talking to him, and he's like, "Well, I've decided." I'm going to do it. Then he pulled out and he had like 8 pages of notes. He's like, well, I guess if I must. But
normally I don't talk, but,
Yep. And it was really moving, heartfelt. And so, yeah, it was awesome. It was real.
But I think those are real. The reason I wanted to bring those up, and I'm glad you brought up Kathy too, and we've seen this. So when we read these passages, and they're kind of, they were written thousands of years ago, but we all see people that live this way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Consistently. And that's a total encouragement.
But it's something you got to be looking for and something you got to be searching for. And you got to realize there's one prerequisite to following Jesus. And he proves it on this Sermon on the Mount. You got to be searching. Because a lot of this just seems so contrary to everything that's going on in the world, and especially in this Jewish setting. Here he's come to fulfill the law, like bring it to another level in love.
Yeah.
That people are more important than rules or procedure. Well, these people, it's turn them on their head. So you got to be searching and figuring out what the problem is.
And that's exactly what he did. Before we take a break, I want to remind you to rate, review, and share on all our social media platforms. That helps out the podcast, so be sure and do that. Let's take a break. So, Jace, you probably didn't know this, but the average American has 97 points that they could add to their credit score, and they have no idea how to get them. Did you know that?
Points are good, huh?
Points are good. More points are better. That's been around as long as we've
need more
been.
points.
So the data scientists at ScoreMaster have cracked the code on how to add 97 points to your credit score. So it's really going to help you. You have to take out a loan. It's going to help you save money in the long run because it's going to lower your interest rate the higher your credit score is. So that's one of the reasons you want to check these guys out. Just takes a minute to get started. If you go to scoremaster.com/Phil, that's scoremaster.com/Phil, they're going to see how many points that they can add to your score. Because all of us know in times where interest rates are probably going to go up, when you're worried about inflation and things like that, you need to be able to get the best possible rate that you can. So if you want to check them out, scoremaster.com/Phil.
So my typical day yesterday, I went fishing over at Willie's Pond because I just, I'm addicted to eating crappie. And so glad that he's stocked that pond. And I caught a crappie literally on the first time I set it out. Bam. Almost a 2-pounder. Well, the next time I throw it in there, it's about a 3-pound bass. And it was hard for me to lift him over the bridge. I got a little bitty rod and reel that I'm catching these crappie. It's not designed for large bass, but so when I was kind of swinging him out in front of me, and when I swung him over the bridge, he fell off, and so I threw him back. Well, then every time I would put it out, I got a little cork and I got a jig, and so every time I put it out, I'd get a hit. And I'd get the fish up and he'd come off. I mean, this happened for the next hour till slap dark. I mean, I bet I missed 20. I was like, I cannot figure this out. And so I had the one crappie on up, I was going to put him on ice and maybe catch some more. So when I was going to put the hook, you know how you put your hook on the bottom?
It broke off.
My hook was broke. When the bass fell off, it broke my hook. And so my point is, I realized, because I was fixed to go study this.
I would have checked that after about number 2. I wouldn't have waited till 20.
Well, that's exactly what I was fixed to say. I was like, why didn't I stop? And I was going to make this as a spiritual analogy. I wasn't searching the problem. I just kept looking, thinking, this is insane.
How do I keep missing this
How do I keep missing? What
By
is
the time
wrong
you
with
got
me?
it corrected, they quit biting.
Well, it was dark. I didn't notice it till I was putting it up. Well, I mean, usually your hook doesn't break off. Just think about that.
That is rare.
I mean, that's a rare thing. But I thought when I went back, I was like, well, I got my motivation tonight to tackle this Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, because I had skimmed it and I thought, I got nothing. These are qualities that I struggle with, that I think everybody does. And they're seemingly the opposite of the way we naturally react to things. So how do you practically do this?
But Jase, you may have a good point when you said that, things you struggle with, because we get a lot of, feedback from our audience, and they always say, well, I want to be like you guys. I want to be able to, study like you study. Or I want to, and they keep making it out like we've got this thing figured out, but we don't. And because anytime you approach a text, I'm always lacking. But I decided a long time ago, if I had to be, perfect, or had to be like on top of something I was preaching, I would never preach.
That's right.
Who could preach and teach if you didn't have if you had it down? There's no having it down.
There's no having it down in your struggles. But I will say this. These are somebody call them attitudes, and I think that's right. And you're struggling, you're trying, and you're searching to put these things into your life through the Spirit. But I will say this: there's a lot of false teachers out there, and a lot of people who are not mature in the Word or in the faith.
Yeah.
If you have a leader, when you watch their character or how they operate, and you start going down this list and you're not seeing any of these qualities, it's a really good way
That's a great point.
to look at somebody. I mean, there's a difference in struggling, being aware of your problems, and then having a guy who possesses none of these qualities.
It's a gauge of sorts.
I agree. I mean, especially because it really covers everything. I mean, you think about, later on you find out that some secret sin, and you're like, well, he wasn't really hungry and thirsting for righteousness.
He was hungry and thirsting for the wrong thing. Yeah.
Well, right. So today we're going to look at the second half of the Beatitudes, which are just as challenging as the first half of their relationship with God. But I did a little study on the first one because I thought this was my biggest struggle. Because look, when you read this verse, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy, it's just hard to be merciful. Especially when somebody does you wrong.
Yep.
It's just hard to do. Now, you tend to look at, I think this starts in like when people say, well, what does it mean to be merciful? I think most people think forgiving those who don't deserve it or helping those who can't help themselves. That's a pretty good idea of what most people think. But I think the more I study, there's way more to it than that. And I think
here's the internet definition: mercy, compassion or forgiveness shown towards someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. So, just the word itself, it's phrased like, in other words, you extend to them compassion or forgiveness when you could punish or harm them for what they've done. So that's not a bad definition.
So there's a lot of verses. I mean, I think the one thing is you got to realize that God is merciful. I mean, there are literally hundreds of verses. And it doesn't just say he's merciful. There's a phrase that I kept seeing which says God who is rich in mercy. So when you think about us being poor in spirit, it does coincide with God being rich in mercy.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. And you also got to realize that we all as humans, everyone past the age of a little kid, needs mercy at some point in their life.
Yep.
So, James addresses this. There's a whole section in James, but I'll just read this. James 2:12 and 13 says, speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, which is in contrast to every other law that we know of. Because guess what you have with the law system in any kind of nationalistic, judgment? No mercy. They ain't worried about giving you mercy. And they're sure as heck not worried about giving you freedom. Because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. And then it says mercy triumphs over judgment, which flies in the face of everything that we really think that brings success.
Right.
Because you have to have, when it comes to laws and criminal activity, you have to have a legal system. Just imagine if we didn't have that, where punishment and judgment for your act wouldn't work. So then you say, well, how come God's mercy works in this realm? So how would y'all answer that, just as far as an overview of God's mercy?
Because in God's case, it still doesn't take away from that there's judgment. I mean, even though he's rich in mercy, it's also very clear that he's also
he,
our
being
judge.
God, has the authority,
Right.
to not extend mercy.
That's right.
Here's the law. The law was added so the trespass may increase.
Right.
We studied it in the book of Romans.
Yeah.
In other words, in the law and everything about it pointed us to the author of mercy.
Right.
That's in Galatians. Remember, it said the law was given for a reason.
Right.
It's to point us to Jesus. So you're no longer under the supervision of the law.
Right.
Mercy triumphs over judgment. It's a wonderful thing.
Well, my short answer, Jace, is that the way
everybody is rebellious toward God at some point in their life.
The way that God the Father still is able to extend judgment and mercy at the same time is he offered all the mercy through Jesus Christ, his son.
Yep.
Exactly.
That was the way.
That is
so
correct.
So if the sin is put on him, so then no matter where you are.
And there was a horrific price to be paid in order to be merciful.
Part of himself became a human being and died.
Whew.
I mean,
Well, and I think in this
And
context,
you look at the price, what bought you.
in our legal system, it's all about what you can prove. You have representatives and, some of them may be shady, some of them not, but you might have done it. You might have get away with it.
Right.
There's so many loopholes. But
you got a high dollar defense attorney trying to make you look as best he can.
Exactly.
That's right.
But with God's plan, he knows your heart. He knows what happened exactly. You're like, oh, no, it wasn't me. Oh, yeah, it was you. I saw you. I know. I saw the whole thing.
And he even knew what you were thinking before you did it. So you're never going to slip one by him.
But that changes everything.
Hang on, let's take another break. So, Jace, I've noticed one of the things that when you go to an airport or you travel, that almost everybody has earbuds now.
Yeah.
In the old days, they would have like the cans, like we have the big old huge Bose. But now everybody, I guess technology, everything's gone down to the smaller, fitted in your ear kind of a thing. Listening to music, listening to podcasts, maybe listening to Unashamed, which would be really good. One of our sponsors is a company called Raycon, and they make really good earbuds. They're most comfortable ones I've ever worn, because sometimes some of them are bad about falling out. They give you 3 or 4 different sizes to be sure and fit your ear perfectly. So you get 8 hours of playtime, 32-hour battery life. There's a built-in mic so you can take calls, which is really good. They're half the price of other premium audio brands, so it's a good deal. And they come with a 45-day happiness guarantee. We like happiness guarantees. So check them out. Our listeners can get 15% off if you go to Raycon, Raycon, buyraycon.com/unashamed, buyraycon.com/unashamed, save 15% and start hearing some good music podcasts.
That changes everything. You're not going to.
When the one who extended mercy, that'd be Jesus. I mean, for him to be merciful, you would have had to been God,
right?
To say, I'll forgive you,
right?
Yeah.
And really, the only way to miss the mercy is to miss Jesus.
Oh yeah.
I mean, now to me, people talk about how hard it is, but it's really not that hard. It's just it's a hard decision to make. But the pathway to mercy is not that difficult if we're willing to be poor in spirit and allow Christ, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I wanted to read this Ephesians 2:3, because it kind of, we were running around, verse 2, as members of the kingdom of the air, which is not God, the evil one. And it says, verse 3, all of us lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our sinful nature and following its desires and thoughts. And like the rest, we were by nature objects of wrath, which there's the judgment. But verse 4 says, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, because I wanted to read one verse where it says that hundreds of times, but made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you've been saved. So really, when you go back to Matthew 5 and why Jesus is doing this, he's setting a foundation to show and prove his love.
Right.
By saying, look, the law was intended for you to realize that you can't keep it. You need help. You're gonna break God's law, because that's what sin is.
And if in your heart you are extending forgiveness, you would only do that if you were merciful. Without mercy, forgiveness, it doesn't come. It's not there.
That's exactly right.
You're like, you say, well, judgment, you like, if I'm just going to letter of the law for it to work, you say, be merciful, I'll forgive you.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's why.
That's one of the hardest things for human beings to interact with each other to do.
That's right.
It's just, why don't you just forgive them?
Whether or you begin
you don't
to
realize what they did. You say,
you put
look
conditions.
what they did to Jesus.
Remember when Peter I think it was in Matthew, where Peter asked Jesus, he said, how many times do we forgive, Lord? 3 times?
Yeah.
7 times. I mean, like what's the number, magic number? But then Jesus tells them a story about, it's not about a number. 7 times 7. You can. It's not a number.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Because they kept trying to make it back to a legal. This is how many
That's
times.
why. I think that's why.
in America, you don't even get 3 strikes.
No.
You're
No,
out.
you get one. But that's why
Then you're
God set
canceled.
this up. You know, in Romans 13, he set up the governments and all. You can actually be a criminal, be locked up for the good of society, which we're all supporting. We support our, police, and you have to have this in play. But you actually can be free in Christ, which is our job. That's why we have prison ministries and
While you're
different
under
things.
lock and key.
Yeah, I mean, God has provided this. You can be a captive in a nation, locked up, and still,
Death row.
live through because of God's mercy of
That is
surrendering
correct.
in Jesus. But you're going to have to go back to where it started and have these types of qualities, which have been absent. I will guarantee is why you wound up there. You
Yep.
weren't poor in spirit. You weren't mourning about anything except getting caught,
That's right.
which, masters of manipulation.
So Jace, to that point, our old friend Randall, who does our prison ministry from our church, he was in federal prison he was a drug mule, was a trucker. So he's in federal prison in Oklahoma, and he comes to Christ. To your point, he finds mercy, and so he starts sharing with people. So he's sharing with this Mexican guy, and just tell him about Jesus. And they had a really good conversation. This guy walks over to him. He says, "Why were you talking to him?" He said, "Well, I was just telling him about Jesus, how much he changed my life." He seemed pretty open. He said, "Do you know who that is?" He's one of the top cartel guys from Mexico. I mean, this guy, you don't even look sideways at this. He'll kill you, other people. And he was like, "Well, I just shared Jesus with it." This guy winds up coming to Christ, and he had no chance to get out. He should have never gotten out, but for some reason, he got out. They changed some whatever. He goes down and starts a church in Juarez, Mexico. And the cartel thought
Where he had been busily running dope back in
now he started a church, starts preaching. All these people, 1,000 people come to Christ. The cartel thought he snitched. The only way he got out, how would he get out? They knew he had a double life sentence. So they kill him. He was martyred. This just happened last year. They martyred him in front of his church and in front of his church people.
Killed him while he was there.
While he was there, Randall said he was singing when they killed him. So this is something like right off the pages of Acts.
Yeah.
And so the cartel thought, "Oh, we'll shut it down because we're taking, we cut the head off the snake. We show you we're in charge." Randall said that about 500 members when they killed him. He told me today 2 of his brothers have taken over the church. 1,500 people have now come to Christ. I thought, man, what a story. I mean, that's the ultimate mercy story, and how that the evil one sets out to destroy. But he says, nope, you can't kill what we're trying to do.
That's right.
I wrote down a few points about this merciful, but I thought we had to talk about that system there. But the first thing I wrote down was we're merciful with the little stuff. And what I mean by that is we all have things about our personalities, and especially when you get in a marriage context, you're going to have to overlook certain things.
That's right.
And the verse I thought about was this in Ephesians 4 when Paul said, "As a prisoner for the Lord." Now he was in prison because he was out sharing Jesus, but he says, "I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling." And then he has these types of attitudes that we've been reading about. Be completely humble and gentle, be patient. And then there's this phrase, bearing with one another. And I thought, what does that mean? There's where the little stuff comes in.
That's exactly right.
Because no matter what you do, and anybody's been married over a week,
Speak for yourself, Jason.
realizes that
I
some
thought I was going to say a year at least.
A week.
He said a week.
well, because the honeymoon week, everything pretty well goes smooth.
Unless you have strep throat in Hawaii.
Yeah.
There are exceptions to the week, but you realize that there are some days that no matter what you do or how your attitude is, it ain't gonna happen. You walk in and it's just not gonna happen. I mean, so you have to be merciful in those moments. And I mean these little things about, it's just your partner or your friend's going to have a bad day from time to time.
We have a lot of interaction with the homeless where we meet, and they're on the streets, and we marry some, and we give them enough money that they can, instead of their honeymoon being under an overpass, we provide where they can go to a motel. And someone says, why would you spend that kind of time and effort with those people?
Yeah. Well, look,
because
mercy triumphs over justice.
Because all people are worth it. Let's take a break, Jeff. Well, I can say this sponsor is definitely one of my favorites because they have the most comfortable sheets that I've ever slept on. It's called Boll Branch. Jace, you're sleeping on some. Dad, you're sleeping on some. You didn't even know it probably.
You spend a third of your life in between the sheets.
And you want them to be comfortable.
I have no complaints.
Dad likes his a little warmer. I like mine a little cooler. You know, everybody's kind of got their style that they like.
Cold.
I do too. These are lightweight, 100% organic cotton, which is excellent for all seasons. This company was founded in 2014 by a husband and wife team, which is pretty interesting. Just kind of that Americana story, which I really like these guys. And it says here that 3 U.S. presidents are sleeping on Boll Branch sheets, so we're in good company. We like these guys. So check them out. You get them worry-free for 30 nights. You get free shipping and returns, but you're not going to want to send them back. Our listeners get an exclusive 15% off your first order when you use the promo code Robertson. If you go to Boll and Branch, BOLLANDBRANCH.com, bollandbranch.com, promo code Robertson, 15% off. Great night's sleep.
Well, one of the points, I had this later, but I'll go it since you brought that up. One of the points was that mercy should be premeditated, which is the opposite of premeditated murder.
Great point.
Yeah.
But premeditated mercy,
that's the heart part in all this.
Well, it's where you're looking for the outcast and the lonely, and because that's what Jesus did. But the reason I bring this up, and I'm glad you brought up about the homeless, is that Matthew, who, let's face it, was an outcast.
Yep.
He was a tax collector. And the reason they had such a bad reputation is because they had so many kickbacks going on. You know, you basically are the representative.
You were getting wealthy off of your job.
Like, guess what? The Romans want 10, whatever the name of the denarii, and he gives the Romans, 4, and he keeps 6. And I mean, these people were just scoundrels.
Yeah.
But he was an insider first because he was from the tribe of Levi. That was his other name, was Levi, which meant he was a Levite. So he was set apart to be a priest, but then became a tax collector.
He was legalistic to the core.
Well, the reason I bring him up is because later on in Matthew 9, you say, what's this got to do with mercy? As 9:9 says, Jesus went on from there, and he saw a man named Matthew. Well, this is a guy writing the book, which is awkward. You know he's awkward because he's put this in chapter 9. I'd have put this in chapter 1. And he says, follow me. And he told him. Matthew got up and followed him. And I read this in other translations, which I think is really cool because this next verse 10 says, while Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, it says many tax collectors and sinners, and some of the other translations were invited.
Sinners are in quotation marks.
Yeah,
right. But it says they were invited and they came and ate with him and his disciples. And because I think that's a key word, because when you think, well, what are these people doing here? Well, you never would think that they would say, well, we invited them.
That's right.
I mean, who invites?
Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?
Yeah.
Which then launches...
that covers a lot of ground.
Well, that launches a 3-year battle about this.
I mean, 2,000 years later, that was my point a while ago. 2,000 years later, we've had more than one say, why do you fool with them?
Why would you invite them?
When you think about a pimp,
they're human beings,
a drug pusher, or all that, you're just like, well, nobody likes these people, which is
that's right.
Fair enough.
You get them out of jail, and some of them said, so you're paying the bail to get them out? And the last brother we did that with, there's been a few of them, he said, I thought y'all forgot me.
Yeah.
I said, we didn't forget.
Yeah.
So look what he goes on to say. And he says this many other places, but he says on verse 12, here's my point. On hearing this, Jesus said, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But watch the next verse. But go and learn what this means. I love this because he's looking at teachers of the law and all these debaters, and he quotes this Hosea 6:6. He says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have not come to call or invite the righteous, but sinners. Well, that turned them on their head. And really, when you think about this, on what that verse means, it's like when you read Romans 12 and it says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, this is your spiritual act of worship. But when you put it in context of this verse, it almost makes you think that being merciful is actually more important than worshiping itself.
It is.
Yeah. Basically, while you're there, in Matthew 9 there, it's not the hell. They said, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? On hearing this, Jesus said, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means, because it's a tough thing. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners.
Exactly.
When Jesus says
you
go,
have to learn that.
when Jesus says go learn what this means, that means you should have a timeout.
Plus, it doesn't come automatic either.
But to your point, though,
It's a
Jace,
learning process.
To your point, think about this. So he's speaking to these people who are supposed to be the spiritual leaders of Israel. You're the ones, you've studied it, you've done it, you've worshiped in the temple, all this stuff. He's basically saying you've missed the whole point because you're only concerned about people that look like you. Mm-hmm. And so when I read that, Jace, I think about from Hosea's day all the way forward. So we're talking about hundreds of years. These people have gone to the temple and they've made their sacrifices, their goat, their lamb, their dove, their whatever it is they bought to sacrifice. And yet their
they're
heart,
saying that's it.
That's it. They can walk out and have no mercy.
I fulfill the law.
And he says, you know what? I don't want the sacrifice. That's not why we designed that. I want your heart to be merciful. I want you to be like me. And so to me, it was an indictment. When I read that, I thought, what an indictment on them.
That's right.
Because you should have been the ones leading Israel in this. Instead, you didn't.
Well, that's why he did this over and over. You remember the story? Because I think this comes under the category of you've got to love your neighbor. But what if your neighbor is not the same color as you or has done horrible things or whatever you could come up with?
We still have in America white churches and black churches as the norm. I'm like,
exactly.
Of all the places, you should not see that. It's the churches should be known for everybody being there.
All people. That's exactly right. I agree.
Well, you remember the story Jesus told about the guy. This is in Luke 10. You know, a man was going down from Jerusalem, Jericho, and they stripped him of his clothes and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead. And a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed on the other side. So too, then
which meant, Jace, that not only passed him, but he moved over.
He avoided.
So he wouldn't have to be right next to him.
He avoided the wreck and carnage.
Let's take our last break.
Well, then a Levite, when he came to a place and saw him, passed by on it, moved over. But a Samaritan, so why is he bringing up a Samaritan? Because you have people that are supposedly not supposed to associate with other people. He's traveled and came where the man was. Well, he saw him, took pity on him. He didn't care who he was, where he was from. He went and bandaged his wounds, and he poured on oil and wine. He put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, took care of him. He took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him until I return. And so Jesus asked the question, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of the robbers? And the reason I'm reading this is because what the expert in the law replied.
It's a picture of mercy.
He says, the one who had mercy on him.
Yep.
And Jesus said, go and do likewise. So, I mean, that was a point that is, it's not just like something he threw in the Beatitude. You see this over and over and over. He quotes that Hosea 6 over and over.
And to your point, the Samaritan reference would be to racial impurity because they had been taken away 700 years earlier and never were the same. They were occupied by, another country. And so the Jews of southern Israel, Judea and Jerusalem, they looked up north to their neighbors and said, no, we don't have anything to do with them because they're not pure like us. So it's right to your point that the impure person, and I say that in air quotes, is the one who offered the mercy and the sacrifice, which is Jesus' whole point.
Exactly. Well, another one I wrote down is the merciful recognizes the source of the persecution. And you say, what do you mean? And I want to read this in 1 Timothy 1. I think this is really good. Because when you realize, even to go back to the, a marriage situation where there might be having a bad day or whatever, in the world, you got to realize people who are doing all this persecuting and hurling abuse, and because there's a lot in here about falsely saying all kinds of things about you. Well, we have in 1 Timothy 1, I think, a blueprint for how this happens. In verse 13, it says, Paul said, even though I was once a blasphemer, a persecutor, and a violent man. So he brings up when he was the one hurling abuse on people following Jesus, I was shown mercy because, and he puts down in here the source, because I was acting in ignorance and unbelief. The grace of our Lord was poured out on me abundantly along with the faith and love that are in Christ Jesus. Well, then he goes on and says this, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I was the worst. But for that reason, here's this phrase again, I was shown mercy, so that in me, the worst of sinners, Christ Jesus might display his unlimited patience as an example for those who would believe on him and receive eternal life. So that's what happens. You got to
cut to the chase. The only way you're getting out of here is to be shown mercy.
That's it.
He said,
We're all in need of mercy. And he was saying, look, I was acting in ignorance and unbelief. Well, when someone persecutes you or falsely says something, instead of getting angry, Ephesians 4, I think 30 says all that, get rid of all rage and bitterness and malice, and because people are going to do you wrong. Yep. But it's instead be kind and compassionate. Y'all remember that phrase. Because you got to realize, what do hurt people do? They hurt other people.
Yep.
You realize they're ignorant. They don't believe, they don't know this. So you have to kind of go beyond what's on the outside and
And remember, Jason, the mercy is in Christ, because look what he finishes that section out with in verse 19 to Timothy. He gives him some instructions. He says, some have rejected these and so have shipwrecked their faith. Among them, Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan to be taught not to blaspheme. Now, that shows you right there can still be judgment, but of people that cross a line, which they crossed. And Paul said, look, these people are not doing us any good. So I have said, away from us.
It happens among the faithful.
It does. So it's really interesting that you can have a mercy base, but still have judgment, which is how we see God. He's always going to be perfect and righteous in his judgment, but he's also going to be merciful through Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I've kind of combined a lot of these things as we talked about that I wrote down, but I think the point he was trying to make, which he's going to make, which is uncomfortable for people who are Pharisaical and teachers of the law, and even our modern religious kind of ritualistic type settings, is that Jesus put people over the law. That's why he had all these moments where he healed people on the Sabbath, and he's like, well, man was made for the Sabbath, not Sabbath for man. And, they're out there picking grain, on the Sabbath. Well, they were hungry, and he took up for them. And so all these situations that happen, well, that trickles down to us. And you realize, you know what? People are going to make mistakes. People may be ignorant of, I remember when I was in Israel and I get on an elevator and I'm like, something's wrong with this elevator. And, it would go to the next floor and the door would open. There was nobody there. It was like, 12 floors. I'd go to the next floor. It would open. I was just getting so frustrated. Well, by the time I got to whatever I was doing and got back, I went over to the desk. I was like, hey, somebody need this button is stuck. And so my friends I was there with, they were like, no, today's the Sabbath. Because the reason it did that, because if you had to push the button, you would be working on the Sabbath.
You are kidding.
Yeah, but look, I've lost my mind because I'm stopping because I was ignorant of what was going on. I'm mad over something that now I'm really mad over because I'm like, Jesus put that on the cross. They're like, yeah, but we don't believe that. And so it just shows you how there was no mercy from my end or their end, but I sympathize, and that wasn't like that was hundreds of years ago. I mean, that was a couple of years ago. They're still doing that. You can't push the button on the elevator on the Sabbath because
it's right back to you not helping the ox out of the ditch, and you know what I'm saying. It's the same. It's just a new set of rules and examples.
But you're talking about frustrating.
Oh
my goodness! So I got to give them mercy because they're not giving people mercy because they're under a legal law system. But guess what? Everybody's mad. Everybody's angry. Judgmental and bitter. And I know that's wrong. So my point is that mercy, you're going to have to, that being premeditated about it, especially when on the little stuff with your marriage and all, you're going to have a plan for that because your nature is not to be merciful.
That's right. And it's going to lead then to the rest of the things. You mentioned understanding where persecution comes from, but also the two we didn't talk a lot about, purity, pure in heart. In other words, I want to be the real deal is what I would call that. And then, of course, he says a peacemaker. So if mercy rules, you're going to tend to be much more at peace with people than at war with people.
That is true.
Which is what you were describing.
Well, I think that pure in heart,
it is much needed.
Yeah,
I think that pure in heart, you get in difficult situations, and if your heart is trying to help other people on purpose, no matter what the situation is, there's something about that's a calming, just aura in all kinds of conflict. I mean, that doesn't mean you're going to get it right or you know what exactly the answer is. But if you think, I'm going to put God first and I'm going to love you, and let's sit down and just say, how can we help this situation? There's something about that purity of heart that I believe is what God is after.
Exactly. And I think that's exactly where Jesus is going to go with the rest of this sermon. Everything after this is going to be a comparison between people who live by law and self-righteousness versus who live by a heart of purity towards God that just wants to follow it.
Yeah, well,
every example, the difference.
Well, a lot of people in the church think that, I just need to keep my mouth shut. Well, that's not being a peacemaker. Now, there are times where you're like, best thing I can do probably say nothing. Yeah. But there's a difference in fighting and, not saying anything but being bitter, and then actually trying to be a peacemaker. I mean, being a peacemaker is difficult.
Oh, it is. And me as a church leader through the years, all of us, but especially my role is, there's conflict between people in the body. And so I don't want to ignore it. We got to get together and figure out what we need to do here. And so mature people, so we're challenged to get it right with your brother. If you can't get it right, bring in somebody to help you get it right. So that's the idea. You don't ignore it, which is what you were talking about.
But in all this, as hard as it's difficult to see, God said, look, you want to be happy on earth? You want to be blessed? You have these qualities.
Yeah.
And at some point, you just got to take his word for it. As difficult as it is for every sinful nature inside of us to do the opposite, I think you trust God here. And look, he gets to the end. Very seldom does he ever say, look, you do this, you're going to be rewarded.
That's right.
I mean, he actually just comes out and says there's reward for having these qualities in your life. Who doesn't like a reward?
Exactly. All right. We'll get back into it next time. Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.